This series is based on my book, Michael Jackson and Classical Music. You can also find Anthony King's Guide to Michael Jackson's Dangerous Tour, as well as Anthony King's Guide to Michael Jackson's History Tour. They're all available on paperback and Amazon Kindle, and you can find out more on my website, anthony-king.com. Why Michael Jackson is the biggest selling classical musician of all time. Michael Jackson sold more albums which incorporated classical music than any other person in history, as well as having the single biggest selling album incorporating a classical composition. For simplicity, I'm going to focus on just two pieces, even though Jackson sold millions more, which included classical samples and classical music. 1. Michael Jackson's Dangerous album 1991. 2. Michael Jackson's History, Past, Present and Future, Book 1 album 1995. Will You Be There and Prelude, Beethoven Symphony No. 9 in D minor, Opus 125, Presto by the Cleveland Orchestra Chorus, directed by Robert Shaw, performed by the Cleveland Orchestra, conducted by George Swell. Will You Be There is a song which was released on Michael Jackson's 1991 Dangerous album, and went on to be released as a single in 1993. This is Michael's longest song on any of his solo albums, and it's interesting to note that this is very much partly because of the great Ludwig van Beethoven Symphony 9 in D minor and the performance by the Cleveland Orchestra. The choral sample is from the fourth movement. Ronald Sutherland of the New York Times wrote in 1992, "The Cleveland Orchestra contended yesterday that Michael Jackson and Sony Music Entertainment Incorporated had gone too far when they included a 1 minute 7 second segment of its recording of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony." The lawsuit was ultimately settled in late 1992, and it was stipulated that all future copies of Michael's album Dangerous must officially credit the Cleveland Orchestra and Ludwig van Beethoven. Little Susie. Michael composed a haunting song which was included on his History album called Little Susie from Maurice Duruffel's Requiem Opus 9. Michael's version is edited to join together two beautiful sections. It is a haunting and very emotional piece. Michael uses a full 1 minute 57 seconds. Calculating album sales is almost impossible to do exactly with reliability. It's not a science, and it's filled with exaggeration and inaccurate data. One of the most credible sources that I can find is chartmasters.org. One of the site's authors, MJD, analysed Jackson's sales over 50 pages, and it was credible, reasoned, well-sourced and compelling. Of Michael Jackson's sales, Chartmasters tell us, overall, Michael Jackson is up to 323.7 million equivalent album sales. However, they tell us that this is not representative of the actual sales which they have included based on their credible formula, based on streams, downloads, physical sales, multiple sales, etc. Equivalent album sales of Dangerous, 45.3 million, and equivalent album sales of History, 31.3 million. Total approximate sales of Dangerous and History, 76.6 million sales. Now, I am comfortable with those numbers because I know that this is a conservative estimate. For example, it doesn't even include Jackson's single and DVD sales. The cumulative tally of his physical singles over the course of his career is up to 79.35 million, they state. Will You Be There, which contained the Beethoven composition, spent 6 weeks in the UK Top 40 charts and was released as a single not factored into these figures. So not factoring in the live performances and additional sales and products, Michael Jackson exposed more people to classical music live during his single History Tour than 5 years worth of sold-out performances at the great Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall has one main auditorium and 2 additional halls. The total capacity is just over 3,600, and they put on approximately 250 shows per season, we are told. Now, Michael exposed approximately 4.5 million people on the History Tour alone, live, in addition to millions who watched the live broadcast, like the Sat1 Olympic Stadium Munich show. Each of his shows on the tour included, very approximately, at least 4 minutes of classical compositions and often a lot more. Now, Michael Jackson was an expert in classical music and incorporated over 15 pieces into his live shows, from the great Beethoven to Bach to Carl Orff, to various contemporary classical composers. Michael included opera, choral works, orchestral symphonies, traditional folk songs, patriotic marches, and fanfares in his shows, and over 20 classical works in his albums, broadcasts, and music videos. He performed tours and shows his whole life to tens of millions. At least 3 of those world tours included classical music. In fact, if we do a YouTube search of the phrase Michael Jackson History Tour, we are given about 3.6 million results. Now, we will not factor any of this into our calculations. I include the comparisons with the other top-selling classical pieces of music and artists in detail in the book, but the evidence is pretty clear. Conclusion: Michael Jackson has a credible claim to the top classical spots. The evidence, in my opinion, points to 3 artists having a credible claim to the top spot. I should probably mention that History itself was actually a double album which counted as 2 units. However, it was re-released as a single unit album too. It all gets quite complicated. However, if we add Michael's albums of the 323 million equivalent album sales, which included classical music, to his DVD sales, which also incorporated classical music, and other media and shows which incorporated classical music, then the case is very strong for Jackson to be at the top of the list, and certainly within the top 3. Could the Dangerous album be the biggest selling album of all time, which includes an actual classical performance? Now, if no, what album has sold more which includes the classical recording? The data points to this having a real chance of being true. Find out more in my book, Michael Jackson and Classical Music, which is available on my website, anthony-king.com.